It began not with thunder, but with silence. The kind of silence that lingers inside hangars long after the tools have stopped ringing. Before the war truly had a name, before Europe cracked open, before Pearl Harbor bled smoke across the sea. There were men pacing the concrete floors of Lockheed's skunk works. Sleeves rolled, pens chewed to wood, a deadline hanging like a sword from Washington's neck. America needed something impossible. A fighter that could climb like a rocket, strike with force, and fly farther than any pilot could imagine. A machine that could guard bombers from a continent away. Europe was burning, and even then, the Army Air Corps knew. They'd need a sword with wings. And so, out of Burbank's heat and hope, came the twin booms. Two long, gleaming arms stretched wide like a raptor in mid-turn. A cockpit nacelle, like a pod or a bullet, hung between them, daring the wind. Two engines instead of one. Counter-rotating props. Turbo superchargers humming like jazz on fire. It didn't look like a plane. It looked like a question. And its answer would change the war. Its name was the P-38 Lightning. Clarence Kelly Johnson, not yet the legend he'd become, stood beside the prototype in 1939 and squinted into its future. He saw the numbers first: speed, altitude, horsepower. But he also saw risk. The design pushed every edge of what was considered stable. The booms had to be perfectly balanced, or they'd tear themselves apart. The cockpit had no redundancy. The controls required finesse. And compressibility, the tendency for air to slam into solid, could strike like a brick wall when diving near 500 Mach. No one had ever flown that fast and lived to talk long about it. Even before the Lightning entered war, it started taking lives. Test pilots called it the fork-tailed widowmaker. Engine-out landings turned to cartwheels. One rookie stalled during a climb and plummeted like a dart into the Mojave. Another lost power on final approach and exploded before the wheels kissed dirt. At Burbank, the wreckage was swept, documented, and rebuilt. Again and again. The Lightning didn't arrive gentle. It arrived fierce and flawed. But it was never ordinary. In the air, when she flew right, she moved like something alien, smooth, fast, and eerily quiet for her bulk. The engines purred in sync, then howled apart in sharp turns. Her silhouette looked like a dragonfly from above, like a hawk from below. And to engineers who dared to believe, she looked like the future. In the deserts of California, where wind stung like glass and the heat made mirages dance across the salt flats, test pilots wore oxygen masks and prayed. The Lightning climbed higher than any U.S. fighter had before, scraping 40,000 feet where most engines froze or choked. She could fly over 400 masts at a time, when even the P-40 struggled past 300. She didn't need to turn like a Spitfire. She just needed to get there, first, and shoot first. And still, the Germans laughed. From behind their gun sights, from the safety of their ground crews and flight schools, Luftwaffe instructors scoffed at reports of this American oddity. Zwei Schwänze? They mocked. Two tails? That's not a plane. That's a barn door with wings. Some called it the flying coffin, a clumsy monster that would surely snap apart in combat. They weren't afraid. Not yet. But in 1940, as Europe began to choke on smoke, the whispers reached Berlin. A twin-boomed fighter, unusually fast, long legs, silent over water, American-built, with industrial muscle behind it. The Germans still didn't fear it, but they watched it. In the States, factory lines were humming. Women riveted fuselage plates under red lights. Men shaped aluminum around fire-warmed molds. Engines were slotted onto jigs like heart transplants. Each lightning rolled out silver and angry, its nose pointed skyward like it already knew the path ahead. And in the minds of those who would fly her, the boys not yet shipped to Europe, not yet blooded, she became more than metal. She became a symbol of reach, of power, of what might be possible if America stopped playing at neutrality and began building for war. The earliest lightnings didn't serve in Europe. They went west, to the Pacific. But that came later. In these early days, the P-38 was still sharpening its teeth. Instructors drilled students on emergency descents, dead stick landings, engine balancing. Stories spread of the man who dove too hard and blacked out, of the one who forgot to feather his prop and went into a flat spin, of the one who made it home with a cracked windscreen and white knuckles. But the Lightning learned, and so did her pilots. For every crash, Lockheed adjusted. They smoothed the wing edges, balanced the booms, tuned the turbochargers. The Army sent reports in blood and wreckage, and Kelly Johnson read everyone. He did not mourn sentimentally. He mourned scientifically. If a man died in the Lightning, Johnson wanted to know why. Because he believed the plane could do more than fly. It could win, but only if it survived itself. In 1941, even as Germany steamrolled across continents and the Luftwaffe owned the skies over France, the first production P-38s stood ready. Not perfect, not yet tested in battle, but ready. One squadron commander at March Field stared at his new planes and said, "It looks like the kind of bird that belongs to a war we haven't invented yet." And in a way he was right, because the war the Lightning was born for was still coming. It would arrive with smoke and metal and oceans of blood. But when it did, the skies would never look the same again. War came first not to Europe, but to the Pacific. Not in the ways generals planned, but in the way war often arrives, sudden, brutal, and very far from home. Pearl Harbor had burned. The Philippines were falling. Japan, Izu, was sweeping across island chains with practiced precision, leaving behind only ash and echoes. And into this chaos flew a plane that looked more like a bird of prey than a fighter. The P-38 Lightning had not yet fired in anger over Europe. But the Pacific needed range. It needed climb. It needed a twin-engine fighter that could cross the endless blue, carry its own life in both wings, and still bite when it arrived. The Lightning was not yet legend. But in this war, legends are born fast. It began in the heat. In the steaming jungles of New Guinea, on sodden airstrips carved out of mud and mosquito-choked grass, Lightnings first tasted combat. The humidity rotted boots before the soles could wear down. Maintenance crews fought as much with rust and jungle rot as with the enemy. Cockpits became ovens. Turbos screamed in protest. And still, the Lightning flew. It was in this theater that pilots began to speak of her as something more than machine. She could take off from crushed coral, bank low over palm-fringed bays, and climb straight into the clouds. Her guns, 4 50-caliber Brownings and a single 20mm cannon, were clustered in the nose, delivering tight, devastating bursts without the convergence guesswork of wing-mounted fire. When she hit clean. But the jungle did not forgive mistakes. Neither did the sea. Pilots who lost one engine often didn't make it back. A flame-out over open ocean meant a long, slow glide towards silence. Survivors remembered the way the water looked from 10,000 feet. A mirror, indifferent, stretching beyond hope. Some made it home on fumes and blood. Others didn't make it at all. Yet it was here, not in France, not over Berlin, that the Lightning became a killer. April 18, 1943, a date etched not in stone, but in vengeance. The mission was called Operation Vengeance. Its target, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the man most responsible for the war America never wanted. U.S. codebreakers had intercepted his itinerary, a rare visit to forward units near Bougainville, a window, small, fragile, in which the Japanese giant might be reached. But the task was enormous. Yamamoto would be flying in a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, escorted by Zero fighters. The route was long. The clock was unforgiving. The interception would require stealth, timing, and deadly accuracy. And it would require a plane fast enough to do what no other American fighter could do. It would require the Lightning. 16 P-38s took off from Guadalcanal. 4 were selected for the kill. They flew low, just 50 feet above the waves, for nearly 500 miles. Radar silent. The sun beat down on silver wings. The horizon shimmered. One mistake and they would miss him. One failure and they'd never return. They arrived almost to the second. At 9:34 a.m., the Lightnings climbed sharply and spotted the formation. 2 bombers, 6 escort Zeros. No one had ever tried this, to assassinate a high command officer from the sky, across an ocean, with timing so precise it bordered on impossible. But the P-38s didn't blink. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber dove into the formation. The sky cracked with machine gun fire. 1 bomber fell in smoke. The second flared briefly, then disappeared into the canopy below. The Zeros scattered, but the damage was done. Yamamoto was dead. Killed in his seat, his body slumped still in uniform when the wreckage was later found by Japanese search teams. The Japanese high command was stunned. How could Americans have struck so deep, so precisely? The answer lay in the twin booms and long legs of a plane they'd underestimated. Half a world away, the Germans heard the whispers. The Lightning had drawn blood. But the Pacific held more than jungle. It held ice, and the Lightning would fly there too. In the far-flung Aleutians, wind-swept islands clawing out of the Bering Sea, another war raged. The Japanese had taken Attu and Kiska, and for the first time since 1812, American soil was under enemy occupation. The sky was gray, heavy with salt and sleet. Here, flight was misery. The Lightning was never meant for this. Her engines hated the cold. Oil thickened like syrup. Pilots climbed into cockpits lined with frost. Breath froze on masks. Hands went numb before wheels left the ground. And yet they flew. Because someone had to. Over volcanic rock and snow-veiled ridges, lightnings roared low, engines howling in the silence. They intercepted enemy reconnaissance planes. Strafed Japanese positions hidden in fog. They were alone, often unsupported, and always frozen. One pilot later said, "The Lightning wasn't built for the Aleutians, but neither were we, and we both adapted." It was survival by stubbornness. The weather downed more planes than combat. Ice formed on wings mid-flight. Some lightnings simply vanished into clouds, never seen again. But those that endured became part of a rare breed. Machines as resilient as the men who flew them. Back in the jungles, the Lightning was evolving. Maintenance crews began learning how to tune her for the tropics. Pilots whispered tricks to each other before missions. Climb shallow if she's heavy. Throttle early if you smell fuel. Don't trust your altimeter in fog. Use the feel of her wings. The bond deepened, not just between man and machine, but between crew and plane. They began painting nose art, naming their lightnings like old friends. One was Miss Virginia, another Scatterbrain Kid, another Yamamoto's Nightmare. And through it all, a quiet shift was happening. Germany was still laughing at the Lightning, still calling it a curiosity. But Japan had seen it, felt it, and buried their dead beneath its shadow. The jungle, the ice, the long blue sea. They all knew now what the lightning could do. She could fly far. She could survive hard. And when called to kill, she did not hesitate. By 1943, the war over Europe had changed. No longer was it a quick blitz or a distant conflict echoed in foreign headlines. Now, it was a slow grind of steel and fire. Every day, the sky grew darker with bombers. Every night, entire cities vanished in ash. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, now faced the weight of American industry, not just in theory, but in thunder. And behind the B-17s and B-24s came something new, something with twin tails. In briefing rooms across the Reich, German officers still scoffed. They had read the reports. A twin-engine American fighter, long-range, fast, supposedly, but ungainly, vulnerable. A fork-tailed toy, one pilot called it. An escort made of scaffolding. The Luftwaffe did not fear the lightning. Not yet. But the Americans had learned something in the Pacific. They had learned how far the P-38 could fly, how high it could climb, how hard it could strike, and most importantly, they had learned how to kill with it. Europe was a different battlefield, colder, denser, packed with flak and fighters trained in the art of ambush. But what the lightning brought was new. Reach. Until now, American bombers had flown deep into German territory alone. Their defensive gunners clung to myth, the combat box, the mutual protection doctrine. But it wasn't enough. The Luftwaffe tore through formations over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Berlin. Hundreds of bombers went down. Thousands of men never came home. What they needed wasn't more armor. What they needed was a shadow. A shape to ride above them, to strike the hunters before they struck the herd. That shape would be the P-38 Lightning. It began with long-range escort missions from bases in England and Italy. Lightning soared over the Alps, thundered across the Channel, and met bombers somewhere near the kill zone, where German fighters circled like wolves. They flew high, scanning for dots in the sky. They flew low, listening for the whine of Messerschmitt engines. At first, Luftwaffe pilots underestimated them. They dove headlong, assuming a slow turn radius, a sluggish climb. And they were often right. The Lightning wasn't a nimble dancer like the Spitfire. But it was a predator in its own rhythm. Its twin engines gave it resilience. Its turbo superchargers let it climb high and still fight. And its concentrated nose-mounted firepower allowed for one clean burst, not a spray, but a punch. Veteran Luftwaffe ace Heinz Knoke later wrote, "I first thought it was a bomber. Then it turned, and kept turning. That's when I knew something had changed." The Lightning didn't win every fight, but it forced the Luftwaffe to think. And then, to fear. One day over southern France, a German Staffel, 12 planes strong, engaged what they believed were lone bombers flying without escort. The Gaffreur dove in confident. Seconds later, the sky split open with 50 caliber fire. 3 Focke-Wulfs never pulled out. The rest scattered. It was a trick the Americans perfected. Let the Lightning fly high and unseen. Let it wait like a hawk. And when the Germans came in for the kill, the P-38 would fall upon them like thunder. One pilot, Major Jack Ilfrey, described it like this: "You don't dogfight in a Lightning. You dive. You fire. You vanish. It's a hitman, not a boxer." And hit it did. In the spring of 1944, over Italy, over Romania, over the Balkans, the Lightning took scores. Rail yards exploded. Bridges buckled. Enemy convoys vanished into smoke. It wasn't just dogfighting. The P-38 became a scalpel for tactical strike. It was the Lightning that escorted bombers on the raids against Ploiești, the lifeblood of German oil production. It was the Lightning that flew cover on the runs that shattered ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt. It was the Lightning that kept bombers alive long enough to return. Even the Luftwaffe began to admit it. Reports from Jagdgeschwader 27, a famous German fighter wing, began to carry warnings. The American twin-boom fighter exhibits high-speed climb and dive characteristics. Must be approached with caution. The mockery faded. But it didn't happen all at once. There were setbacks, tragedies. The Lightning had its flaws. At high speeds, especially during dives, a phenomenon called compressibility could lock the controls. More than one P-38 pilot never pulled out in time. Over France, two Lightnings pursuing a fleeing Bf-109 both went into unrecoverable dives and slammed into farmland below. No parachutes, no survivors. Another issue was visibility. The center pod gave pilots an excellent forward view, but little over-the-shoulder awareness. Many died from attacks they never saw coming. Still, the kill counts mounted, not just in numbers, but in names. Major Richard Bong, America's top ace, flew the P-38 in the Pacific and racked up 40 victories. In Europe, pilots like Robin Olds flew her with deadly precision. The Lightning was no longer an experiment. It was an executioner. And still, the Germans tried to adapt. They ordered tighter formations, trained young pilots to avoid direct head-on passes. They studied captured Lightnings, noting weaknesses, drawing diagrams. But time was running out. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost its edge. Too many aces were dead. Too many replacements flew with barely 20 hours of training. Fuel was scarce. Morale was worse. The Lightning did not flinch. She climbed into skies thick with flak. She dove through tracer fire. She returned again and again. And as the war turned, as German cities burned, and the Reich began to fold inward, the Lightning remained overhead. For German pilots, it became a ghost, one they couldn't shake. An ace named Erich Hartmann, who would eventually survive the war as its highest scoring fighter pilot, once confessed, "The twin-tailed American was not always the fastest, not the most maneuverable, but it never stopped coming. And when it did, it shot first." There is something terrifying about inevitability. The Lightning wasn't a trick of strategy. It wasn't a momentary threat. It was a signal that America was no longer just arriving. It was dominating. That for all the Luftwaffe's elegance and early glory, there now flew something built not for beauty, but for total ruthless reach. And as Berlin's skies grew black with smoke, the twin tails carved across them, a final warning written in vapor trails and fire. The Germans no longer laughed, not at the forked tail, not at the coffin, because by now they had learned what it really was, a promise that there was no place left to hide. Every legend eventually meets the limits of its own making. By the winter of 1943, the skies above Europe were iron gray and bitterly cold, a world of vapor, fuel, and frost where even metal seemed to shiver. The P-38 Lightning, the American twin-tailed predator that had carved its name across the Pacific, now faced an enemy far older than the Luftwaffe. Cold. It crept into the cockpit seams, froze the throttles stiff, and fogged the windshields from the inside. Pilots climbed wearing 2 pairs of gloves, wool beneath leather, but still lost feeling before they reached altitude. The oxygen masks froze against their lips. The defrosters failed. The heater ducts, designed for California, not the continent, barely worked. Some joked that the Lightning's cockpit was the coldest place in Europe. but no one was laughing when the engines began to choke. The twin Allison V-1710s were powerful, but temperamental. At 30,000 feet, where air thinned and oil thickened, one misfire could turn triumph into tragedy. Compressibility, that strange new word engineers whispered about, became the pilot's nightmare. Push the nose too steep in a dive, and the air itself turned solid. Controls locked. The stick froze, and the ground came up faster than prayer. Many never pulled out. The Americans learned this the hard way over northern France. Two Lightnings escorting bombers on a return leg broke formation to chase a pair of fleeing 109s. They dove through thin cirrus at over 500 miles an hour. Then their controls jammed. Witnesses said they never leveled. Both slammed into farmland just beyond the Channel coast. Nothing left but a crater and a single silver tail. Sometimes, one mechanic muttered later, the Lightning kills faster than the Germans. It was a cruel irony. The very speed that made her invincible at altitude could make her a coffin in descent. Pilots began whispering the name that would haunt her reputation for years, the Widowmaker. Yet they kept flying, because for every disaster, there was a discovery. Engineers in England's cold hangars worked night after night, sliding frostbitten fingers along control rods and trim tabs. They learned that deploying flaps at certain speeds could break the dive log. They adjusted turbo settings, changed oil mixtures, rewired heaters. Each fix came at the price of another life. Out on the airfields of East Anglia, Lightnings sat wing-deep in snow, their propeller blades coated in rime. Ground crews scraped ice from intakes with kitchen spatulas. The smell of antifreeze hung thick as smoke. And still, every morning, the engines roared, not in defiance, but in duty. Inside the cockpit, it was a different war. The pilots wrote home about it, letters stained with oil and coffee folded between flight logs. Dear Anna, the Lightning still scares me. It trembles when she climbs, then steadies like she's testing my nerve. I talk to her now, not sure if that's madness or survival. The sky is colder than I imagined. If the heater breaks again, I'll land in Sweden and call it diplomacy. Behind the humor was fear. Behind the fear, pride. They knew they were flying something no one fully understood, a machine ahead of its time, punished for being first. In the mess tents, men argued whether she was worth it. Some transferred to P-51 Mustangs when they arrived, claiming the Lightning was cursed. Others refused to give her up. She got me here, one said, and until she doesn't, she's mine. Meanwhile, the enemy adapted. The Luftwaffe had stopped underestimating the twin-boomed silhouette. Engineers at Messerschmitt modified the Bf-109G series with better dive recovery and higher boost pressure. Focke-Wulf pilots trained in new tactics, baiting the Lightning into tight turns, forcing her to bleed speed where she was weakest. They attacked from below, where the twin engines made blind spots, and escaped in steep dives the Lightning dared not follow. It became a chess match of altitude and angles, every move countered by physics itself. And yet, even in defeat, the Lightning remained respected. German intelligence reports still called her the most dangerous American fighter above 25,000 feet. But danger was not enough. The war was moving faster than she could evolve. By 1944, the Mustang arrived, sleeker, warmer, easier to fly. It could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back without the quirks that haunted the P-38. Slowly, painfully, the Lightning's glory began to dim. She was reassigned to photo reconnaissance, to ground attack, to roles no less brave but quieter in fame. Still, the losses lingered. Over Belgium and Holland, wreckage littered the fields, silver bones and black soil. Villagers found fragments of wings, burnt maps, dog tags half buried in snow. Sometimes, decades later, children playing near creeks would uncover twisted propellers or the broken glass of gun sights. Every legend has cracks. The Lightnings were carved in ice and fear. But those who flew her never spoke of betrayal, only of respect. They called her temperamental, not treacherous, demanding, not dangerous, because they knew what she gave when she was good, a chance to come home alive. And so, the story of the P-38 became not one of perfection, but of persistence. The men who mastered her did so not because she was easy, but because she wasn't. She punished arrogance and rewarded skill. She was, in every sense, a machine that separated the brave from the merely willing. In the end, the Lightning's greatest weakness was also its strength. It wasn't built for comfort or mercy. It was built for reach, to go where others couldn't, and to keep going long after the body froze and the mind begged to turn back. Above the gray continent, amid the flak and frozen breath, the Lightning fought on. Flawed, faithful, and unforgettable. And as one pilot wrote, in a letter found years later among the effects of the missing, "If I don't return, tell them she tried. Tell them we both did." Fade on snow falling over a silent airfield, engines still, twin tails gleaming beneath a winter moon. By late 1944, the laughter was gone. The skies that once belonged to the Luftwaffe were now gray corridors of retreat. Smoke from burning oil fields rose like columns, marking the end of an empire. German pilots still flew, but fewer now and younger. 17-year-olds in patched leather jackets who'd never known peace. They climbed into cockpits that smelled of fear and gasoline, praying their engines would start. Above them, the sound came, a deep, splitting roar that was no longer strange. Twin engines, twin tails. The Lightning had arrived again. What began as an experiment had become a symbol of inevitability. From the beaches of Normandy to the snow-clogged passes of the Ardennes, from the ragged fields of Italy to the shattered railways of Austria, the P-38 Lightning hunted without mercy. It was not reckless anymore. It was refined, surgical, cold. Its pilots no longer chased glory. They chased coordinates. Reconnaissance units, flying the unarmed F-5 variant, had mapped Europe from above, one photograph at a time. Their cameras caught not beauty, thus, but precision. Bridges, troop columns, convoys creeping through fog. It was the Lightning's silent work. The intelligence behind every Allied bombing run, every armored push. Before D-Day, it was the Lightning that photographed Normandy's beaches at dawn. Months before the invasion, tracing every bunker, every fence line, every inch of the tide. Long before the soldiers landed, the Lightning had already walked the ground. By autumn, it was no longer a weapon of potential. It was a weapon of pattern. The Luftwaffe, bleeding dry, called it der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil. It wasn't just a nickname. It was an admission. Reports from Jagdgeschwader squadrons spoke in the language of exhaustion. The twin-boom fighter operates in all weather, all times. It attacks from altitude and disappears before we can react. It is not an aircraft. It is a strategy. In the Italian campaign, Lightnings prowled mountain passes like wolves among cliffs. They struck rail convoys, strafed airfields, shattered fuel depots. German supply officers learned to flinch at the sound of engines echoing through the Alps. That low, twin-pitched growl that came just before everything around them erupted in flame. In the Balkans, they dismantled retreating columns one by one, blowing bridges as the enemy crossed them. The Germans learned to move at night. Even then, The lightning found them, guided by moonlight and instinct, the pale glow of its twin booms flashing across rivers like the glint of a blade. There was a new kind of terror in that sound. It wasn't the brute thunder of a bomber raid. It was a precise hum that meant someone, somewhere, was already watching. The lightning killed not with fury, but with patience. In the frozen winter of 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the lightning flew its strangest missions yet. Heavy snow blanketed Europe. The airfields were mud and ice. Engines seized on the runway. And still, the P-38s took off. Low visibility, no formation, flying by instinct and memory. They carried bombs under their wings now, a role that once seemed beneath a fighter. But war changes everything. On December 24th, 1944, with the weather briefly clearing, hundreds of Lightnings and Mustangs lifted from Allied bases. They found the German columns massing below, tanks crawling through Ardennes villages, men trudging through white silence. The Lightnings dove first. At 400 miles an hour, they turned the snow black. Trucks erupted. Tanks cracked open like eggs. The Lightning's guns cut through forest lines until even the trees burned. Survivors later said it wasn't a battle. It was an execution. That day, the Luftwaffe barely showed up. They couldn't. The Reich's fuel reserves were nearly gone, its airfields in ruins. Even the elite fighter wings were grounded, their planes cannibalized for parts. The Lightning no longer met equals in the air. It met ghosts. And yet, the pilots didn't celebrate. They knew the cost written on every mission report. Men lost to weather, to flak, to fatigue. The Lightning's dominance had come at a price measured not just in victories, but in silence, in the empty bunks of the men who'd flown one mission too many. It was an old truth of aviation. Mastery is always purchased in blood. And when Germany finally began to break apart, the Lightning was there too, circling cities that looked less like fortresses and more like tombs. Cologne, Dresden, Munich, each one scarred, each one silent. The Luftwaffe, once arrogant and untouchable, was now grounded in defeat. Captured pilots spoke with a kind of awe, the pride stripped from their voices. One, a former Focke-Wulf ace, said in interrogation, "We laughed at the Lightning, at its shape, at its noise. We thought it would fail before it reached us. Then we saw what it could do. It never turned back. It never stopped. We underestimated the Americans, and that machine was the proof." Another, younger, simply said, "It came from nowhere. We didn't even have time to curse." By war's end, the Lightning had flown more than 130,000 missions across every theater. It claimed more than 1,800 enemy aircraft destroyed in Europe alone. It photographed France, Italy, Germany, Austria, even Prague in its final days of occupation. It had begun as an experiment. It ended as the eye, the sword, and the memory of Allied air power. When peace finally came, the world changed again. The jet age dawned. Propellers faded into history. The P-38 was retired quietly, its frame too heavy for the new speed of the Cold War. The last production model rolled off the line in 1945. Silver, immaculate, and suddenly obsolete. But those who had flown her never forgot. In reunions years later, veterans still spoke of the Lightning not as a machine, but as a companion. They remembered her quirks, the hiss of her turbos, the vibration of her yoke, the way she trembled in crosswind landings. They remembered her smell, oil, metal, and cordite. And most of all, they remembered her sound, that twin-toned heartbeat that told them, somehow, they were still alive. At one such gathering, an old pilot named Jack Ilfrey raised his glass and said simply, "The Germans stopped laughing the day they realized the lightning wasn't chasing them. It was above them." And that is how history remembers her. Not as perfect, not as invincible, but as relentless. A creation born of American ingenuity, tempered in the fires of two oceans, misunderstood by friend and foe alike. She flew higher than most, faster than most, and at her best, deadlier than all. The P-38 Lightning was never just an aircraft. She was an omen, proof that the future would belong not to elegance, but to endurance, not to myth, but to mastery. In the end, when the smoke cleared and the empire that once laughed lay in ruins, there was still one thing moving in the sky. A lone lightning circling above a broken city. Twin tails cutting through the dawn, a whisper of engines fading into the new silence of peace. The sky no longer belonged to the Reich. It belonged to the men who had earned it.